This podcast is for you if you want to learn about the wonderful and wacky world of the English language and the people who speak it. If you want to learn English, speak English, and understand different speakers of English, then you're in the right place and you're going to love our podcast episode today. Welcome to English World with Kris Amerikos. We are a team of language lovers, expert teachers, and native speakers who are on a mission to help people around the world speak English and show the world their true value. We correct mistakes, practice pronunciation, and explore grammar rules while drinking coffee and having fun. So get comfortable, relax, grab a pen and paper, and welcome to the show. Today's episode is brought to you by English Every Day, an unlimited speaking practice program where you can join live speaking practice lessons with professional native teachers 5 times every day. There are a lot of courses on the internet and a lot of useful videos too, but the one thing that is missing for most English learners is practice. And if you need speaking practice, then English Every Day is for you. So click the link in the description or go to krisamerikos.com to learn more today. Today, we're here with Maria from English to Excel. And Maria, tell us a little bit about, how you got started in this English space.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good question. So I actually started my whole career I've spent in marketing, corporate communications, a little bit of journalism, and news writing at the beginning. So throughout my whole working life, you could say this theme of communicating has been present. So communicating the right message, crafting the right message, using the right words, that's always kind of been my thing. But I've always worked for mostly tech companies, and my work has taken me pretty much around the world. I've lived and worked in 6 countries now, in Munich, Germany, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, London, New York, Geneva, Switzerland. Now I'm in the Bahamas right now. But the cool part about that experience abroad is that I really got to dive deep into what I love most, which is languages and language learning. So I learned German when I was in Munich, Dutch when I was in Amsterdam, French when I was in Geneva. And while I was over in Europe, I met my husband, who's from Spain. So right now I'm learning Spanish. But not only did I get to learn those languages, but I really got to kind of develop experience what it was like to have to live, to have to work, and to have to survive in a language that wasn't my own. So
Absolutely.
kind of coming back today and kind of the English teaching piece, right now I'm helping others do the same in English. So I founded English to Excel. So I'm really all about helping people speak better English for better opportunities, mostly in a professional context. So helping them speak better business English to then, get their dream job, get promoted, have better travel experiences, advance their careers internationally, really just help them to use English as a tool, as a vehicle, kind of as an enabler to achieve what they want in their lives.
Absolutely. I'm so interested to hear about your perspective now learning Spanish. I'm learning Spanish too. And having that experience of having studied German and Dutch and French already, how does that contribute to your approach and your, how you learn Spanish now?
Oh, that is such an interesting point. And I'd like to see if there's any research about this. I don't know the answer, but what I'd like to learn a little bit more about is if once you learn one language, if it's easier to learn a second, a third, a fourth. For me, I've had the experience that I feel like it is. It's almost kind of like, your brain knows what to do. You kind of know what to look for, like, the drill kind of. But, so I feel my Spanish, I've been able to learn it quicker. And I still have a long way to go. I'm not fluent yet, but, I've been able to learn it quicker than maybe I was the first, the second, the third language. So do you have a take on that? Do you have experience there?
I think it's definitely easier. Like you said, you've already got some like language learning routine that kind of worked for you before, and you saw success there. So the steps to follow. But I think also part of that is like the language of learning languages. So like an English speaker who is learning a foreign language for the first time might not really understand what a gerund or infinitive is, or other things that are kind of simple in language learning, and they might not know what it is. And it's not just English speakers, right? It's anyone approaching learning a foreign language for the first time. You have to kind of activate those concepts in your mind. You might have learned them in school, but probably forgot them because you're not really applying them to real life. But in foreign language learning, they apply. And so then when you approach learning the third, fourth language, you already understand, like, okay, there's probably nouns, there's probably infinitives, there's probably this and that. And so, and then you also have a whole other, database of knowledge, like set of knowledge, which is the second language that you can compare the third language to, especially if they're in the same language group, right? Like, so for you, the carryover from German to Dutch was probably huge.
Totally. Yeah. And that's a really great point you bring up too. I think if, some of the languages are similar, it's obviously going to be easier. But if it's, something, I don't know, comparing English and Japanese, for example, maybe you have a wider gap there. But yeah, it was a breeze, I want to say, going from German was my first language. Then I learned Dutch, then French, and then Spanish. So I had German and Dutch, which are a little more similar. Then I had the advantage of going to French to Spanish, which is a little more similar. And I think you said it too. I mean, you also kind of know what works for you. Because there's so many different approaches to language learning, and what works for one person may not work for another. So yeah, you kind of get your rhythm down, your routine, what things you want to focus on, or I should say maybe the right ways to go about learning and the tactics that you use. So yeah.
Absolutely. And then we both have the advantage of being an English native speaker, an English first language speaker. And it's not, of course, there's all the benefits of English being the lingua franca and all of that. But on top of that, English being an Indo-European language. So like, if you, instead of German, Dutch, French, Spanish, if you were studying Arabic, or like you said, Japanese or Vietnamese, or some of these other languages, then that Greek and Latin element of like the higher level education, and there's not as much carryover. So there's less things that are the same. So I think that's, like you said, languages that are similar are so much easier to learn. And so for us, learning those languages is going to be easier than the others, right?
Right. Totally. Absolutely. And it's interesting too. I feel it's kind of maybe a double-edged sword, because as you just said, I mean, yeah, in one way, we have an advantage, with English being our first language. But I found too, when I was living in these different countries and trying to learn the local language there of each one of them, because I was a native English speaker, that on the practical side, when I would really try to practice the new language that I was learning, that I had a really hard time, because so many people, English, as we know, is the global language. So many people speak it, they speak it well, or they really want to practice and improve it. So I think being a native English speaker, sometimes you have a little steeper of a hill to climb, so to speak, when you want to practice a new language, because everybody wants to practice English and they see you like, oh, okay, she's a native English speaker from the US. Now's my chance. And who can blame them,
Absolutely.
But that always added an extra layer of complexity, to my learning process.
I can absolutely attest to that. I've experienced that too. But now that you brought it up, I'm kind of like trying to play devil's advocate in my mind, and trying to say like, well, because maybe some of those conversations that we get into, because we're English speakers, allow us that social lubricant to move it forward and to advance the relationship, to get to the point where we can practice the language. Whereas if I were a native Swahili speaker in Ukraine, I don't have English, and they would probably go to English immediately if you're not speaking the local language. And so there might not be a basis to continue the communication, right?
Totally. It's really multifaceted, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
But I have the same experience as you that, when I lived in Russia or when I went to Argentina or Serbia or some other places, that the default was, the greeting or the first sentence is in the local language. And then it's clear that you don't speak enough. And it's like, oh, okay, well, let's talk in English then.
Right. Right. Yeah. I know the feeling. I know the feeling well.
So how does that feel like emotionally when you go somewhere and someone kind of shuts you down when you're trying to engage in that language? It happens to me now. I go to a restaurant where everyone's speaking Spanish, and sure, I'm in the United States still, but everyone's speaking Spanish. And I try to join in, and then it's immediately like, let's go to English so that it's clear, because my level of Spanish is just not there. So on the practical level, like, I understand, like, we have to do that at some point. But it still kind of feels like, I'm trying so hard and didn't get what I wanted. Right. What do you think about that?
I am so familiar with this feeling. Oh my gosh. For me, it was like the ultimate feeling of deflation. Like, oh man, I'm trying so hard, to learn the language, and I just want to use it and I just want to get better. But then if you kind of feel like you're shot down, like I would be, I'm just thinking back, when I was living and working in Amsterdam, I was learning Dutch, and okay, I was getting pretty conversational and feeling pretty good about it. And my coworkers would come in the morning, and they'd say, to everybody, to all the native Dutch speakers, the people from the Netherlands, they'd say, goedemorgen, which is good morning, goedemorgen, goedemorgen, and then to me, good morning, Maria. And it kind of makes you feel a little, makes you feel different, makes you feel like you're not really included. You're not part of the group. And they do it to be polite. Their intention is, just to be polite. And okay, I'm going to greet Maria in her native language as a way of including her. But, when you're trying to learn, it can kind of feel like the opposite. And it's a feeling of kind of deflation too, and as you said, there is a practical element to it, if your language skills at that time aren't really up to speed, or, where they need to be, to the point where you can't really have an efficient conversation with someone, or, both people don't really feel comfortable because somebody clearly, can't communicate as smoothly, then, okay, we kind of have to put our egos aside and, all right, we'll switch to English. But otherwise, it can be a hard pill to swallow.
Definitely. And I hear students tell me similar things, but in the States, I find sometimes people move to the States, they go to a shop, they ask for something, the person understands them, but then the person says, where are you from? Or they say, oh, I like your accent. And they make a comment like this. And I understand, like, I'm American, and I always grew up hearing people do that if they heard an accent, and it wasn't necessarily a foreign accent. Just in Florida, if they hear someone from New York, they're going to be like, oh, I like your accent. But a lot of students take that as an insult. Oh, they're saying I have an accent. Oh, they're asking where I'm from because I'm not local, because I I don't fit in or something. But from the American person's point of view, I understand that they're interested, it's an interesting person, and they're trying to just make conversation with them. For students, sometimes there are those situations where they've voiced this to me a million times, that situation of going somewhere, asking for something, and a person asking, where are you from? I guess when I was abroad too, if people asked where I was from, it did show that okay, they noticed something. Right. I'm sure people have said something similar to you about their experience of communicating with English speakers.
Yes, when you were talking, I immediately thought back to one of my college German classes. I was a German minor during undergrad, And my professor, the best professor I have ever had, she was from Vienna. So she was from Austria, native German speaker. And she had I was in Cincinnati going to school, my hometown. And she had been in Cincinnati for decades. I mean, decades. And she said something, basically what you just said. She said, people would approach her and say, "Oh, you have such a neat accent." And they meant it as a compliment, but she really didn't like hearing that. And I'll never forget that. And she said, it makes you feel like you don't belong. And, despite their intentions being good, but I remembered that and kind of stored that in my brain. And I'm kind of a little more conscious now, going forward when I, may want to tell somebody the same thing, but I kind of stay away from that because of that sensitivity. But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic there.
So you live in the Bahamas now.
Yes, now I do.
And what are some of the characteristics of Islander English or Caribbean English?
Good question. Oh, the melody is beautiful. The melody is so beautiful. I wish I could imitate it. I cannot. So I will not do it justice. But I'll stay away from that. But they have a beautiful melody of how they speak. And I've tried to pay attention. I've been here for just a little over a year now. And I don't notice a whole lot of different vocabulary in the English here versus, English in the US, for example. The only things I think I've really noticed is a lot of people here, instead of saying hello, they say good day, which in the US, we don't really say that. And then kind of funny, makes me kind of smile every time I hear it. Instead of people, they say persons, which to my American ear, that kind of sounds like legal, very legal, you walk into a restaurant and, okay, two persons. I'm like, oh, wow, that's very, very formal, it seems, to me. But otherwise, I think vocabulary wise, those are really kind of the only two different words that I've really noticed.
One of my best friends here in Florida, he's from the US Virgin Islands. And so it's really cool to chat with him and hear his take on American culture and American life, because even though they're so influenced by the United States throughout the Caribbean, he still feels like he's not really one of the group or something like this. He feels like, sure, it's not so different. Everything's easy. Life's fine. But and like no problems with communication. But like when he speaks, you understand that he's from the islands. You understand that he's from the Caribbean. And so it's really, sometimes he'll come up with these cool insights because he considers himself an outsider, but most people who meet him probably wouldn't think anything of it, just another Islander person in the United States. There's a lot of them, right? So I was just interested to hear what you thought about it, because I've honestly never been to, I've been to the Cayman Islands.
But not to the Bahamas or anywhere else.
Bahamas now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you ever get here someday, I mean, I love the, I guess the melody, like I said, that they speak in, or kind of the intonation. Maybe another thing I've noticed too, is a lot of times in the US, if we're making a statement, so if we're not asking a yes or no question, but we're just making a statement, we kind of drop our pitch at the end of the sentence. The last word that we say usually kind of has that falling intonation. I think here they may do a bit of like a rising intonation. So just kind of little things like that. But I do find myself sometimes, especially when I first moved here, if I would go into a store or like, a restaurant or something, whatever the case was, I would kind of like find myself like asking them, question after question, just so I could, listen to how they talk, because I really like it. But
that's so cool. English is just so diverse. Everywhere you go, there's some nuance and some difference. It's really cool. So like, you've been traveling living in these different places, working in these different countries and learning different languages. And have there ever been any situations where you like just mixed up the languages? like you're trying to speak French, you're learning French, speaking French, and then Dutch just flies out, or German flies out, or that's happened to me a lot of times.
Kris, story of my life. I mean, this happens to me all the time, still today. And I realize now why that's happening, because I've made some big mistakes in my language learning, apparently. So I'll just give you an example. I was, living and working in Amsterdam, as I said, and then I moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where French is the language there in the city. So I moved from Dutch-speaking country to French-speaking city. And I was like, okay, I was really excited to learn French. I was like, I'm going to go, full speed ahead with my French. So, okay, I guess that means I need to just totally get rid of Dutch entirely. I'm just going to block it out of my mind, just never speak Dutch again. I mean, I'm being dramatic here, but yeah. I told all my coworkers in Amsterdam, I said, all right, guys, I'm really trying to focus on French. I'm kind of already getting the Dutch and the French confused. So let's not speak Dutch anymore. Let's only speak English. And then I can, focus on my French. So that was kind of the plan. They were like, all right, great. So that meant really good progress for my French. My French was progressing pretty quickly. But then when there were times where I'd have to travel back to the office in Amsterdam, or if I was in a situation where I had to speak Dutch again, I couldn't do it. I would try to speak Dutch and French would just automatically come out. Wow. I had this weird experience one time. I was in a bakery in Amsterdam and I was trying to order something and the person just looked at me kind of strangely. And I wasn't even conscious of it, but I was speaking French, trying to speak Dutch, not even realizing that these French words were coming out. Yeah. So, and I realize now the big mistake that I made in just kind of blocking Dutch totally. There's some of your listeners may know a really, really awesome polyglot, Luca Lamparello. I'm totally butchering his name, the beautiful Italian pronunciation. So I apologize for that. But I was listening to him not too long ago and he was talking about this subject. Mm-hmm. And he was just basically saying that the reason why you mix up languages is because you kind of, stop exposing yourself to some of them. So what I should have done, instead of just blocking the Dutch out entirely, I should have kind of kept it alive a little bit in my head. I should have every day, I still should have read something. I should have, watched a show in Netflix. I should have, because what I did was I was signaling to my brain that language wasn't important anymore, basically. So the retrieval mechanism, when it went to go fetch the Dutch to speak it, was too weak. So that was a lesson learned.
That's an awesome story. That's an awesome story. I'm sure a lot of people will be able to relate to that. For me, I've had that experience when I've tried to add a third language. And so my first instinct, it's usually, for me, it's more about, it wasn't about forgetting the language so much, although I've done that too, Italian. I lived in Italy for 2 years and I used to speak with people and go to the piazza and do stuff. And now I don't remember anything. But the first instinct, so when I was in middle school, going into high school, in middle school, I had studied Spanish and then I moved to Italy. And so the first 2 years of high school in Italy. And when I was there, I tried to study Italian, learn Italian, but then I would go to people to speak Italian and Spanish would come out. And after some time, my Italian got a lot stronger and I wasn't studying Spanish. So it switched. But then when I moved to Russia, the first things that were in my mind that when I would go to speak were like Spanish and Italian. And so there's this instinct of foreign language was just automatically going to that first thing that I had studied. And then since I lived in Russia for 8 years and became relatively fluent in it, when I went to Argentina and I'm trying to start learning Spanish, I go up to people and Russian just automatically comes out. It's just like, it's not maybe entire sentences of Russian, but you just get you get in the groove of speaking the language, and you add in all those filler words, and those filler words you've taught yourself to like naturally just throw them into sentences. And so I would find myself speaking Spanish and then throwing in Russian filler words, and that made it just really confusing because some of those words have a different meaning in Spanish. I definitely have been in that situation before, mixing up the languages, and until you analyze yourself, like you kind of have to, you say it and then you think about what you just said, and you're like, that was completely, what just happened? Like you feel embarrassed.
It's like this language salad. So
Yeah.
I'm curious. So when you first learned Spanish, then Italian, and then Russian, right? Kind of in that order.
Yeah. Yeah. In school, I studied Spanish, Italian, French, and Latin.
Okay. Oh, Latin too. Okay.
Yeah, it was a one semester, but I think it was really helpful in understanding like how etymology affects the language. And so like approaching the next language learning steps as like, okay, what's the root of this word, instead of just what's the dictionary translation.
Right. Yeah, it gave you that foundation.
Mhm.
Then I'm thinking when you had moved from Russia to Argentina, and you were in Argentina after that, and you were, kind of trying to speak Spanish, but the Russian kind of kept coming out. Had you kind of kept your Spanish alive at all, I guess, while you were living in Russia? Okay. So
I'm
same.
starting from zero again. And so I was there for only 2 weeks. First week, I like could say hola, and second week, I was like, I need to take advantage of this. And so I started studying online when I wasn't out doing stuff, and I was like trying to push it. And then since then, I've kind of kept this rhythm every day of doing a little bit. But yeah, it was an interesting experience to throw myself in there.
Yeah. And it's funny too, going back to what you said, did I understand you correctly that you said that you would always go back, even when you were learning Russian in Russia, you would kind of always go back to Spanish because that was the language that you pretty much learned first? Did you have that?
Yeah, it was like just this mix, like you said, a salad of languages in my head. But this usually happens to me when it's like the very initial stage of learning the third language, because I don't know. To me, it feels like a foreign language instinct. It's like I've got that one foreign language that I use a lot, and so the instinct is, if I'm using my brain to speak in another language, go there,
Yeah.
Something like this.
Like an automated kind of intuitive. The reason I asked that or brought that point back up again is because I also feel I have that. German was the first foreign language that I learned. And I do find that that's kind of the one that's always like the dominant foreign language. It's like the one that doesn't really die, so to speak, in my brain. I kind of, even now that I'm learning Spanish, I'll often find myself kind of sometimes just translating without really meaning to, translating things from Spanish into German or vice versa. So I don't know, interesting. I don't know if there's something to that or not, but I have that experience.
I think how you just labeled it, the dominant foreign language for you, I think that's the best way. I think that kind of explains it right there, right? That like you feel confident, you feel very sure of expressing yourself in that language, and so it's easy to not regress, but revert back to that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So cool. So okay, let's switch up a little bit. I think everybody has heard that English can get you a higher salary, more jobs, better jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's right. People have been saying it for a long time. Everybody said it. But when it comes to marketing a product, targeting an audience, an English-speaking audience, using the English language as a tool to convert interested leads into happy customers, which aspects of the English language are most important to focus on, in your opinion? Because you have a lot of experience in this area.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, just generally speaking, is when you're trying to convert somebody, no matter what it is, if you want to get them to sign up for a webinar, if you're trying to get them to kind of move them further down that proverbial marketing funnel, get them to buy something. I'll even say, if you're trying to get somebody to take action, so whatever action it may be, you really have to speak their language. You have to, the words that you use, the tone that you use, whether it's more formal, whether it's more conversational, that's what it's going to take, to get them to take that action that you want them to take. You have to help them to understand the why, the what's in it for me, why should I do this, what the benefit is. So it's really just about, and I mean that, it could be whatever language you're working in, whatever language they speak. In the case of English, you just have to make sure, I think, more that you hit those points. So it may not be so much of a language thing. It's just more about really communicating to someone what the value is of taking that action that you want them to take. So that's how I would kind of think about that.
Awesome. Yeah, because there are native speakers of a language who can do it well, and there are ones who can't. And there are non-natives who can do it well in English and ones who can't. And so, yeah, it's probably not the language so much as the skill of using it, right? But I think like maybe there's some aspect of understanding the audience enough to have a marketing message that relates to them, that resonates with them. And like, I think that sometimes English learners who are in this space feel like they're not confident that they will be able to hit that resonant tone in English with the audience. What do you think?
I absolutely agree with that. And I would say that that's the case for any language, because as I've been working abroad, we're targeting the companies that I've worked for. We've been targeting people who speak, many different languages. I've mostly worked for global companies. So we have people that we've been wanting to reach who are, native speakers of not just English, but of everything. Many different languages. And so it always made the most sense that the person who was crafting the message, whether it was a post on social media, whether it was somebody who was creating a brochure, whether it was somebody who was writing, emails for an email campaign, whoever was crafting that content was a native speaker of the language, of the audience that they were trying to reach. And as I said, not just English, but, for any language, because, to your point, I mean, it is really, really challenging. It's quite a lofty goal to really get to a level in a second, third, fourth, foreign language where you really know the connotation of words and what words mean and tone and, idiomatic expressions. And I've met very, very few people who really ever got there. I certainly am not there in any of the languages that I've learned, so when I was, like I said, working for my company in Amsterdam, I never was writing our emails in Dutch. I was never, crafting any of that Dutch messaging. I left that to the native Dutch speakers. So
I think it's really difficult. Out of thousands of marketing people that I've met, I think I've only met two that were non-native English speakers who they showed me their copy, and I thought, this is good enough to be like people wouldn't know that it's not. And yeah, it's really challenging to get to that level, I think.
It is. It takes massive interaction with a language. It takes massive interaction with native speakers, native content, and just time too, time and effort.
How do you stay motivated? Because I guess today we've talked a lot about, these funny situations that we find ourselves in learning languages. And honestly, like most of the situations that we've talked about today feel embarrassing. It's kind of they give you a negative feeling inside, right? So how do we turn that around? Because that's a big part of language learning, is making mistakes and learning from them and not letting it, crush you. So how do you stay motivated?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love this topic because in my view, so much of language learning is the power of the mind and having the right mindset. And I think the right mindset is really make or break when it comes to learning a language. Because as you said, I mean, it's hard, it can be embarrassing, it's intimidating, it can be scary. You can kind of psych yourself out. But there's that quote that I love. I think it goes something like, every master was once a beginner. Basically, you have to be bad at something before you can be good at it. I mean, that's the case with anything, but especially with language learning. You have to mess up before you can speak a language well. That's just part of it. So I think with motivation, a lot of it is just kind of putting the ego aside and, just knowing that you're going to be bad once you begin, but the more you do it, the better you're going to be, and it's about, I think too, like celebrating those small wins, like the first time maybe you have a conversation with a customer service representative on the phone or something, or, the first time you go to the pharmacy and you get what you need and, you walk out the door with, celebrate those kind of small wins and that'll help you to kind of, show yourself the progress that you're making. So I think that helps. And also I would say too, to remember what your goal is, that also helped me to stay motivated, remembering, why I'm learning this language, why I'm doing it. Maybe there was sometimes even like a specific real life situation that would help me to stay motivated. Like my husband's, company Christmas party this past year, he works for a Spanish company. I knew there'd be a lot of native Spanish speakers there. So I had that real life situation keeping me motivated, all right, I gotta, do XYZ so that I'm ready to have these conversations with confidence. And so those things work for me.
I use the same thing. I think it's such great advice for everyone who's listening or watching. Celebrate the wins. Sometimes I have a sales call or a meeting with someone and I'm a little nervous about what I'm going to do before. And when I catch myself in that position, I know that I have to be confident going into it. And so I usually just go back and watch the replays of doing something really cool in that area. And it really reminds you that you can do that. When I went to Argentina, that was my that really motivated me to continue with Spanish was, I was there for a week, really couldn't do anything. I started learning. And then it was like maybe 2 days before I left, I was in a taxi and I had a conversation for like 20 minutes with the taxi driver, even though it was so basic and so incorrect in grammar and everything was probably wrong. Somehow he knew, less English words than I knew Spanish words. So it happened that way. And I was just so excited afterwards. I was like, wow, I've been studying Spanish for about 5 days and I had a conversation with a taxi driver. And so that gave me such huge motivation. And it's like that feeling stuck with me for a long time.
That's a huge win. That's not even a small one. That's a huge one. Yeah. Being able to have an actual conversation with a native speaker, that's a big deal.
I was like, I can do it. This shows me I can do it now. So
totally.
But then I came back to the States and that level of Spanish, everyone's just going to be like, English.
Well, but for now, and I think that's the thing. It's just kind of, you also have to tell yourself, this is the level that I'm at now, but it's not always going to be this way. Sure. I'm going to progress. I'm going to improve, provided you put the work in, there's no magic solution here. But, these are my abilities today, but they'll be better tomorrow. And every time you put yourself in one of these new situations, like having a, taxi conversation, you're going to get better and better the more you do it.
Yeah. Practice makes perfect, right?
Yep.
Although in language, there's really no perfect.
True. That's true. That's true. So, yeah.
Because we can compare our English, we can compare different native speakers' English and say if this is more correct, less correct. Are we judging it based on dictionaries or standards or common usage or right?
It's so subjective. And this is actually an interesting thing too, because, you know, in every language, native speakers make grammatical mistakes, you know, but sometimes the grammatical mistakes are just part of natural sounding language. Like you and I being native English speakers, we would probably never say, I know I wouldn't, with whom did you go to the movies yesterday? Okay, nobody, that's grammatically correct. No, what we say is, who'd you go to the movies with yesterday?
Yes.
So, you know, it's like, okay, is that right or is it wrong? I mean, it's grammatically incorrect, but it really is just natural sounding speech. So it's really just subjective. Yeah.
I had that situation 2 days ago. We were recording a video, an English teaching video. And so I was asking the other person, you know, he said something about, we did this. I was like, with who? And then but we're recording an English teaching video. So I'm thinking, I'm like, with whom?
Oh, wait, that sounds weird.
Yeah. And then I was like, no, with who? And so, yeah, like we know some things are correct, but then still choose not to say them because that's not what people say.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think language learning, it's important, like you're saying, like, you know, throughout our conversation today, we've kind of been talking about the ups and downs of language learning. And it's important for people to remember that, you know, you start learning and it feels like you've made such huge progress and there has to be some downward movement. You're going to forget some things. You're going to make some mistakes with the things you already learned. And that's part of the process. That's how people learn it, right? And so that can feel like a plateau. It can feel like there's no improvement. And powering through the plateaus it decides whether you learn it or not, because a lot of people give up at that point. And especially at the beginning of the language, I feel like this happens a lot because I like to compare it to like just math and say, like, to go from 0 to 1, you increased by 1. Now 1 to 2, you increased by 1. But now when you're trying to increase again, you're going 2 to 4, 4 to 8. Well, that's a bigger increment. And you're trying to catch the same feeling of the 1-step increment, but you're chasing the 2, 4, 8 step increment and looking for the 1-step increment feeling. And so those plateaus, like you said before, staying motivated to get through them, staying motivated through mistakes. How do you suggest that people get over plateaus or get through that difficult period?
One thing that I think works really well is to mix it up a little bit, mix up your language learning routine, take yourself out of your comfort zone, because a lot of times when we've hit that plateau, it could be, oftentimes is, that we've just kind of been a little too much in our routine. We're just kind of doing the same thing over and over. Maybe we're having the same kinds of conversations. Maybe we're talking to the same people about the same topics. So we're not really expanding our vocabulary. So I think switch it up a little bit and challenge yourself. Put yourself in new situations. Maybe you could find like a one-on-one tutor, which there are a lot of cost-effective solutions out there, by the way, for one-to-one classes. But find a tutor maybe, and tell them that you want to talk about a topic that maybe you're not very familiar with. So that'll force you to kind of learn some new vocabulary, learn some new expressions, kind of broaden your horizons a little bit. Sometimes also plateaus can happen because maybe, if we're honest with ourselves, we're really not putting in as much effort as we used to. Maybe we're not spending as much time as we'd like to think we are. So I actually set calendar appointments for myself to kind of force myself to be a little more disciplined, 30 minutes every day, or even 10 minutes every day, 5 minutes every day. So yeah, I think
Daily exposure, that's important.
daily exposure. Yeah. So I think those two things work pretty well for me.
Sometimes people speak really fast. Sometimes people talk really fast, and sometimes it's difficult to understand them, and we have to ask them to repeat themselves. And this is another point of negative emotions that learners experience, ourselves included, when studying foreign languages. And, a lot of people are hesitant and they think that it says something about their level if they have to ask someone to repeat themselves. And to me, it sounds so ridiculous. But at this point now, I do agree that it shows me something about your level. If you're worried about that, then it shows me that your level isn't high enough to have learned that asking for someone to repeat themselves is perfectly fine. But even for us, like in another country, sometimes I would come up to, even having a high level of Russian, I would speak with someone, and it's just the way that they speak. It's just the way that their mouth moves and the way they say those sounds that I just can't get what they're saying, I'm sure that's happened to you too.
Oh, all the time. And it still happens today for sure. I mean, and it's such a frustrating feeling. It can also be kind of a shocking, surprising feeling, because you might think, okay, well, I can understand everything my teacher says in class. I can read, a news article perfectly, or I can read signage at the airport or the train station with no problem. But man, then when I'm, talking to my in-laws in Spain, or, talking to some native speakers, or trying to watch a movie in a different language, I'm totally lost. I can't follow a single word. So it can be really, really frustrating. But I think, there's really no silver bullet here. I think it just takes practice. You have to practice listening, and more listening. One tip that I think works especially well is to, whatever you're watch something, whatever video it is, if it's a Netflix show with subtitles or some kind of talk or whatever with a transcript. Anytime that you can watch somebody talk and have a transcript of the words that they're saying, so not in your native language, but in their language, in the target language that you're trying to learn, I think that can be really effective, because you're seeing the words on the screen as the person is saying them. And so then you get kind of used to kind of what sounds are swallowed, kind of how they smash words together or connect sounds or link words. So you just kind of start training your ear to get used to those patterns of the spoken language. So I think that's a good exercise that helps with that.
Definitely. I think that's a really, really useful suggestion. Maria, thank you so much for taking the time to come and have this chat with me, and to share your suggestions and advice with everyone. It was really useful. Thanks a lot. And tell everybody how they can find you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you guys can find me on YouTube and Instagram at English to Excel. And you're always welcome to go to my website, englishtoexcel.net as well. My email address is there. You can send me a contact form there too. So very awesome. Available.
And we'll put all the links in the description as always. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kris. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to English World with Kris Amerikos. Now it's your turn. Don't just listen to English, speak English with us every day. Join our English Everyday speaking program today. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.